But in this little extract, they've gone on a date. So they've met, they had a coffee, and now they are having dinner together. So I'll just read it out, and then we'll have a little discussion about some of the themes and all the rest of it. The themes, that's important. Issues. They found a pizza place nearby and sat down. The waiter, a disconcertingly handsome Frenchman, asked whether they wanted to see a wine list. Asghar said they didn't drink alcohol. The waiter removed their wine glasses briskly. I always think, said Zahra, that when they take away the wine glasses, it's like they're punishing you for not drinking. It's like they're saying, you're only having soft drinks, so you can't have nice posh glasses, only ones they give to children. It's money, said Asghar. Those guys want tips for pouring the wine. Why do English people want to smell the wine before they taste it? It makes them feel important, I guess, said Asghar. But I don't know about wine, obviously. Trust me, English people don't know anything about it either. I mean, at Formal Hall, they bought the cheapest stuff from the off-licence and just necked it. Yeah, if you laugh there. The waiter returned and they ordered 2 vegetarian pizzas and 2 Diet Cokes. When the waiter came with her drink, Zahra found it was too sweet. I think this is regular Coke, not diet, she told Asghar. Waiter, he called. Don't worry, I can have normal. No. If it was wine, he would have asked you to taste it beforehand. Waiter, please, this is the wrong drink. He put the Coke to his lips and swilled a little in his mouth before swallowing it. It's normal, when we asked for diet, he said sternly. The Frenchman removed the offending drink and quickly brought its correct replacement. Thanks, said Zahra, taking a sip. No problem. My mum always says if you're paying, then you're the boss. Your mum's a wise woman. If the service isn't good, she always argues with the staff. God, my dad does that as well. It's so embarrassing. You shouldn't feel like that. They push it because they think we can't speak English or too ignorant to say anything. I don't like making a fuss. I suppose I'm quite English like that. English people don't need to make a fuss because they get respect already. We have to stand up for our rights, whether it's about Palestine or getting the right kind of Coke. Exactly, said Asghar with a smile. So yeah, it was I quite enjoyed writing that scene because I wanted to get the sense of these 2 people groping in a genre that they can't quite master. So they're trying to go on a sort of English-style date, but they don't drink. So in a way, that process for them doesn't sort of go forward in the same way. They're sort of mimicking something that they don't really know how to fully. They're not in full control over. I was always interested in this idea of mimicry. Naipaul's great book, The Mimic Men, in the mid-60s, is a bit of a touchstone for me, and Naipaul is one of my favourite authors. But in that book, the mimicry of the sort of Western centre is something that's very pained. It's almost a sort of a lack, an injury, a wound that you could never possibly attain to the sort of to the heights of being a sort of a proper, perfect Englishman. These characters are slightly different because they've been born here. They've sort of claimed it a bit more for themselves, and mimicry is a sort of parody as well. So the pretentiousness of the whole wine tasting ceremony that we all observe and go through and that we've seen is something that you can sort of shine in a slightly different light on. And the reference to Palestine there at the end is also quite interesting because they previously just been having a conversation about it. As I said, they're 2 very different characters, Asghar and Zahra, but there are certain points at which they overlap. And in a way, growing up in a sort of in a Muslim community in Britain, Palestine is this hot button issue that everyone talks about and everyone is very passionate about. But Zahra, who sort of feels like she's slightly distanced from that and slightly moved away from that, she also feels like that this is something important as well, and that's because Palestine is an issue that cuts across Islam and also sort of liberal left-wing circles as well. In a way, this is a conversation in which they seem to be understanding each other, but really, if you look between the lines, they don't really understand each other at all.
Yeah, it's interesting. They're sort of both performing. I mean, performativity is quite an interesting theme throughout the book, I guess, and this dialogue, just hearing it read out loud, is quite kind of theatrical in a way. You could imagine it sort of on stage as a sort of comedy of people both trying to be what the other one thinks they should be, but slightly getting it wrong, or being sort of over the top, with Asghar sort of demanding this sort of sommelier of Diet Coke to kind of come back.
The theatrical, or the dialogue. I like dialogue a lot, and I think I try and work on it and try and get that sense of a back and forth between characters. And of course, in this pressurized situation of a date, we all try and invent selves for ourselves, as it were, and then we try and live up to them. But the humour, which I hope is sort of, warm rather than biting, most of the time at least. You sort of love these characters, even for the things they get completely wrong.
But I guess we invent ourselves, but we also invent other people. And something I find so interesting in this book, which comes even from the epigraph, is the way each character is looking to the other for a kind of an ideal, or perhaps looking for something that they feel lacking in themselves.
Yeah, I suppose so. That was the sort of the funny thing is the epigraphs, one from Iqbal, one from Joyce, both about idealism and realism and the differences between those two things. Again, they're sort of playing to my own sense that when you grow up with a set of ideals, in this case of, let's take Asghar, he grows up with a set of religious ideals. He grows up with a set of ways that you have to behave, the way you should do things. And in a way, up until this point in life, he's never really had to have it questioned, because he's lived quite a constricted world. But because he lives in London, he's grown up here, he can see this other world, the world of success, the world where people go out on dates and drink wine, the world. And although he's not sort of attracted, he's sort of repulsed by it, but attracted to it at the same time. And he sort of sees Zahra as his way in to that world, if you see what I mean. Because she's from the same community as him. Their parents know each other. As a matter of fact, their parents don't like each other very much. They're sort of rivals within the community. And there's, rival mosques and all sorts of things going on as well. But because they have that sort of, because he has that sense of that she's, gone to Cambridge, she's somehow she's unlocked the key. How do you actually get to these places from where you are? She's accumulated what he would not call cultural capital, but that's what it is in some ways. And for Zahra, she's somebody who has really, and maybe I'll read it in a second, something that relates to this. She's moved away from her community very, very quickly. She has sort of been smart enough in her view to see, okay, so actually my community is basically very small and not very important and has no real power. And there are all these sort of sermons at the mosque that are fine, but they don't really make sense to me. So I'm going to swap it for something else very, very quickly. And so she swaps a sort of Muslim girl at the mosque persona for a sort of I'm going to Cambridge persona, and that's that's an interesting swap as well. But when she does that, she finds herself making the same kinds of mistakes in a way that Asghar made in that situation there, but at a different level. She comes to report back with this knowledge, but then she finds that the things don't quite map onto each other as neatly as they might do.
And there's that interesting moment where she's after a life lived according to your own choices, but then there's a moment where she starts to question how much damage you do to yourself to be free of those ties, which seems like a really sort of at the core of this book. Whilst she's sort of desperate to be independent and fly free, she sort of also does feel pulled back to.
Yeah, and I suppose it's a motivation for why these two characters get together. She sort of feels like she can be anchored by him, but then, as it were, she can be like, she can be a kite. She can sort of go as far away as possible, but she can be anchored down. But of course, treating somebody as if they're a weight, or treating somebody as if they're not really a person with their own feelings, desires, ambitions, and all the rest of it is a bit of an error. And that's the sort of journey she goes on, I suppose, in the sense that by the end she at a particular point she finds her limit, she finds her line, and it is different from Asghar. But I suppose if you were to make it in a more universal sense, we all find the limits of what we want to do and who we are as people, in the sense that we come to the limits of how many friends we want to have. We come to limits when we get into a relationship or a marriage with someone, when we cut off possibilities. In careers and all the rest of it, we start to realise, what exactly can I do? Am I able to do? What do I not want to do? So in a way, although she's a very young character, in many ways, when I started writing this book a long time ago, she seemed a lot closer to me in age. Reading back on it and changing it, she seems, she's going through in miniature some of the things that I've experienced in my own life. And
there's a bit where she goes to her Cambridge interview and is kind of talking about Shakespeare, and can see the interviewer sort of kind of relieved in a way.
Yeah, that's fantastic. See Kate Bennett right at the back there. Hi Kate, how's it going? Taught me, so maybe I'll definitely tread any toes. It wasn't an interview with Kate. Kate taught me at Cambridge many years ago. But yes, there was an incident which may have some relationship with reality. So when I went for my interview at Cambridge, again, I was a bit like Zahra, in the sense that you try and work out, what do these people actually want? What is, and you have to try and mould your persona and your personality around that. So what I did was I just started to learn bits of Shakespeare off by heart, and I particularly learned, and I give this to Zahra as well. I learned Shylock's speech from The Merchant of Venice, because it is a wonderful speech, but also I knew that if I was going to recite that speech, the interviewer, I would guess, would in some ways it was a way of introducing my otherness, but in a safe way, essentially. It's a way of saying, well, of course, even this great, wonderful genius Shakespeare recognized that, Jews were people as well, and I'm Muslim, and that's a bit like being a Jew. So maybe we could come to some kind of arrangement here, and that I could get accepted at university. And it worked brilliantly. It worked perfectly. I mean, I swear that was the rest of it. The gleam in the eye of the person interviewing me, you know who it is, don't you? The gleam in the eye of the person interviewing me, just as I was saying this, was just like, the colonial speaks, and he speaks Shakespeare. Yeah. Caliban would have been too obvious. Caliban is too obvious. You need to try something slightly different. So it appeals to a sense of I don't. It's not a sort of complaint. No, I love Shakespeare. I love that play. But we all play little tricks like that. I'm sure, and we all have to mould our personalities. But there are limits, I suppose.
I guess that takes on a slightly sort of darker meaning in another section involving drink. Actually, there's food and drink come up a lot in the book in really interesting ways, I think. And there's a bit where Zahra, who fits in, does all she can to fit in at the banking job, which both as a Muslim and as a woman, I suppose there are ways in which she wouldn't fit into the very kind of macho, sort of drinking culture of boozy lunches and so on. And there's a moment where she goes to sort of celebrate her promotion and finds herself given a glass of wine, and which sort of mirrors a moment earlier when in Asghar's childhood, where he's just desperately trying to win a football match, but it's Ramadan and he can't drink water.
Yeah.
And those moments, I think you paint those moments very beautifully, of just these everyday kind of obstacles, I guess.
Yeah, I suppose, if I was to put my pretentious hat on, which I'm very willing to do, there is the Mirage stories of the Prophet Muhammad ascending to heaven and going through various tests. This is a visual and sort of story that's very common in Islamic history and culture. And one of his tests is he gets offered 3 different cups. He gets offered wine, milk, and honey. And what does he get? Wine, milk, honey, and water or something. I'm quite sure which one he takes. It's not the wine anyway. So the idea of being offered a drink and accepting it. But of course, in English normal society, in English society, being offered a drink is an act of clubbability. It's an act of, you go over there and someone offers you something, and to somehow refuse it, you feel slightly disappointed, or you're no fun, or why aren't you doing this? And she comes to her own little compromise as well in that incident. Asghar goes to a school which has a headmaster who's one of those slightly dangerous headmasters who's always quite interested in you for
he's a very dangerous headmaster.
Sort of your background. What is it about you and your religion? And actually, he knows quite a lot about Islam, and he's read about it. He's an expert on the Muslims, as I think Saeed Devasi said of Michael Gove. He's sort of one of those, and well, actually, you don't actually believe all this, because what you believe is this thing that I read in a book, which was, written by a Victorian. That's true. So he gets involved in all that. Actually, playing sport and fasting is I always find it a really fascinating thing for me. I always look, some players, like football players and cricket players, they often actually fast at the same time as playing. And I was quite astonished by this, that they would actually let you do that. But they say that it improves their performance and they're accommodating to them. I think Mo Salah was fasting during the Champions League final, or just before, and Moeen Ali certainly does fast as well during the games. I think he fasts, and most of the Pakistani team don't fast. So it's a sort of weird amount, switcheroo, if you see what I mean. But yeah, they've accommodated that.
Yeah. Would you like to maybe read another bit?
Yeah, so the two characters get together and they get married very, very quickly for various reasons that are explained in the book. But then they have their wedding night, which we'll skip over. It's a brilliant scene, but we'll skip over because it's too embarrassing for me to read out. So what we'll do is we'll just read the... So Zahra goes for breakfast, a wedding breakfast at Asghar's parents' house. So the characters we have in this very short bit are Asghar and Zahra. We have Mr. and Mrs. Delani, who are Asghar's parents, and then we also have one of my favourite characters in the book, who I wish I could have given more space to, Fatima, who is the sister of Asghar. Okay. As Zahra had predicted, they were late to the breakfast. Mrs. Delani had already cooked an oily banquet of fried eggs and fried bread. Asghar apologised for keeping them waiting. No, it's fine, said his mother, wiping her hands on a faded royal wedding tea towel. It's better sizzling, but you must be so tired from yesterday. You must be exhausted, no? Asked Mr. Delani. Was it Zahra's imagination, or had he exchanged a naughty glance with his wife? Zahra, said Fatima, turning to her new sister-in-law, which prayers did you recite before your wedding night? I'm not sure. The usual ones, she answered. Asghar had warned her about his father's creepy jokes. He had not mentioned anything about his irritatingly devout sister. She seemed like the kind of girl who spent her nights leaving comments on religious websites. I've got a special version for my wedding night, said Fatima. On such a night, nothing is more important than Allah's blessings. We're trying to find a boy Islamic enough for Fatima, Mr. Delani told Zahra. It's very hard. She keeps on saying their beard isn't long enough. Aren't you still at school? Zahra asked. I can get engaged now and get married later, she said. That's how everyone does it these days. We'll see about that, said her mother. The last boy who visited was very good. Tall, handsome, full beard, Mr. Delani said. Guess what she said? He wears too tight trousers. They were awful, exclaimed Fatima. They are the latest fashion, protested Mrs. Delani. I don't want some fashion boy, she said. I want a serious guy to study with in Iran. Why not wait until you get out there, Zahra suggested. You'll find lots of seriously religious boys. There might be joint seminars, said Fatima dreamily. There are joint seminars, by the way. Don't encourage her, said Mrs. Delaney. First, Asghar is disappearing, living God knows where in London, when there is a lovely upstairs bedroom for you here. She stopped herself just in time, refocusing her annoyance at the safe target of her daughter. And now you want to go gallivanting to Iran. Let's stay a family a bit longer.
It's so funny how you have so many characters sort of talking all the time, and everyone has a kind of a point that's they're sort of not really listening to each other. They're sort of showing off to each other in a way.
Yeah, they're not really talking. Yeah, and Asghar, you notice, doesn't really say anything in this exchange. So he's like the silent observer of all these four people having these cross-purpose conversations, interrupting, going in here and going in there. And that's one of the pleasures I find personally in writing is well, we've got our expert on conversation right here, but he can tell better. Right, there you go. But yeah, just trying to get a sense of how these characters don't really listen to each other and how they sort of talk past each other. And also Zahra's rather sort of prim sense that in this situation she becomes you're at school, you shouldn't be getting married. She sort of takes on the sort of the role of the protective, slightly outraged Guardian reader, if you see what I mean. You know, it's all sort of, well, you shouldn't be doing that at school, that's so worrying. She's a little bit sarcastic to Fatima as well, because in a way she sees Fatima as the exact opposite of herself, what she could have been but has escaped from. And
she's certainly keen not, she'll put up with sort of Tupperware curries from Asghar's mum coming into the freezer, but she definitely isn't interested in living with them, is she? I mean,
no.
Sort of
I think it's key that they
together.
don't live in the same house, they move away in some ways, because they have to create their, and it's for two reasons in a way, because Zahra wants to create her own life, but it's also because I think Asghar also feels the pressure of his family, like they're just so big as personalities and they're slightly crushing of him, and he wants to.
And he doesn't really know who he is, does he? I mean, he's exploring it through the novel, as they both are. But of the two of them, I think Zahra, although it doesn't always serve her well, has much more of an idea of what she does want, whereas he is, I mean, perhaps through his sort of childhood experiences that we learn about, he's never really had a sense of direction in quite the same way.
Well, they have an argument later on in the book where Asghar takes her to task for something that she's done, and she says to him, well, you know, you've never actually been tested in life. You've never actually had to have, you know, what's the good is all your sort of moral virtue that you're claiming for yourself, but you've never actually put it to the test. Whilst I've gone out there, I've gone into different worlds, I've tried to do things, I've tried to change things. Now, of course, actually, the reader will know that he has gone through certain tests in life, and he has, has been a victim of various things which are not particularly pleasant. But what I like about him as a character is that he's so enthusiastic. Yeah, he'll take up one thing and he'll just absolutely run with it without really thinking about what its consequences are. And that leads him into a bit of trouble as well.
How much does sort of gender inflect their relationship, do you think? Because it seems to me that a lot of Asghar's sort of childhood experiences are around being kind of tough or sort of not tough enough. And I wonder whether Zahra, or thinking especially of Zahra and Fatima, how much feminism was kind of informing you as you were writing?
I think with Asghar, he's a funny sort of boy, really, but I think a common type that doesn't tend to be written about very much, because, you know, we talk about these ideals, and the ideals of, there's these twin ideals of masculinity. So you have the idea that you become a sort of, a grave preacher or someone who sort of takes on a sort of a masculine role, and he has a character who he sort of aspires to be quite like. But there's also this idea that, well, if as a man you should be sort of chatting up girls and be sexually attractive, and he can't really fit in either set because he's just a very nervous, shy person in many ways. And that's some of the humour of the book comes in through his sort of failures with women. There's a lot of failures with women in this book, so I had to be very imaginative. Very serious, by the way. It was a real test. For that. So that's him really. And with Zahra, I think would she call herself a feminist? I don't know. Maybe she'd wear like a T-shirt saying something, or
the one Theresa May has. So.
Yeah, exactly. That, or kind of in a kind of a safe way. I think she's ultimately just an individualist. She just really sees what where she wants to go and what she wants. But of course, at every stage. Whether you're a man or a woman affects you in different ways, and for her, she has a different set of challenges. She is somebody who is attractive, and so boys want to talk to her and chat her up. She needs to set up a kind of sense of, well, who am I? Am I going to do this? Am I going to go out with this guy? Yeah, I'll go out with this guy, or and let's see how that goes. But where do the limits lie for me as well?
That's something I find most moving, I think, with Zahra, is her trying to kind of work out what she actually thinks and trying to disentangle what she actually thinks from what she sort of thinks she should think. And those two aren't always easy to tell. So, I mean, how does anyone ever know whether they're thinking what forces that have acted on them, like their families? And it's very interesting seeing. I guess we've talked about them on their date where they sort of meet each other without anyone else present, but then when you see them in the context of their families, you get a very different or a wider sense, I suppose, of their positions.
Yeah, with Zahra, she, as I said, she does behave in different ways around different people, as we all do, and she does. It's quite interesting. She's quite when she goes to university, and then when she goes and she works in the bank, she sees that it's important to be a little bit skeptical of that world, because actually to buy into it too much means that you are actually not quite part of it. So effectively you have to become a sort of piss-taking English person and not take anything very seriously to be taken seriously. And that's the thing she has to learn. But when she comes back to her own family, when she talks to Asghar, she's suddenly, all these things that, like formal hall that she's taking the mickey out of, she's like, oh, well, actually, it's quite important, these ceremonies and all the rest of it. Because again, she can impress that person with what she's gained. I really, she's possibly the less lovable of the two characters in some ways. But I think there's a sort of spikiness to her, but I quite like that about her.
She manages to have a good time clubbing, just about.
Yeah, she does, yeah. I've got scene set at a mosque, scene set in a club, no place is foreign to me. I can go anywhere, everywhere. That's just me.
Do you want to go to Spain? Maybe?
Yeah, let's go to Spain. So they go on a honeymoon. And Asghar decides on Spain. Again, it's one of these like fortunate things where, the usual community wedding would be, the Maldives or Dubai or like at a push India or something like that. But he chooses Spain, which Zahra's quite pleased about, because like, oh yeah, that's actually, it's the kind of European destination that my friends would go to. And they want to see Andalusia. And like a lot of British Muslims, as far as, and including myself who's been there, it's this sort of weird romantic place where you think, well, here were European Muslims and they were here in the Alhambra, and there is a scene set in the absolutely astonishing Cordoba cathedral, mosque, mezquita, whatever you want to call it, which I don't know if many of you will probably have been there, but it's a mosque, or rather originally it was a small church. Then it became a much bigger mosque, I think in the 10th or 11th century, with these astonishing red and white banded pillars that look like palm trees from the Umayyad time. But after the Reconquista, I think the 13th century, the church was built. A church was built effectively, or cathedral was built inside the mosque. So it's this sort of weird double space, which is sort of in ways emblems of them as characters, but it's got these sort of weird energies to it, where it's a sort of, and in a way Granada is similar to that as well. So here's a bit when Asghar and Zahra have just been to Granada, and they've seen the Nasrid Palace there, and Asghar is reflecting on what he has seen. Asghar and Zahra left the palace and climbed the crowded tower where Boabdil, the last caliph of Spain, had been forced to surrender the city's keys to the Christians. Looking out at the stunning mountain landscape that had once belonged to the Muslims, Asghar felt incredibly sad. He had hoped that visiting Granada would make him feel proud of those early European Muslims, whom he regarded as his spiritual ancestors. Yet he found the city suffused with melancholy. Every church was built on a destroyed mosque. The palace of Charles V, next to the Alhambra, was a grey stone monstrosity that had replaced the great mosque. All that was left of a great civilization were a few quaint tourist spots. All Spain's Muslims had either been converted or expelled. It might have been a long time ago, but Asghar took the Reconquista personally. For him, it recalled the ethnic cleansing of the Bosnians only a few years earlier. Perhaps, he thought gloomily, given the way things were going, something similar could happen in Britain. He looked at the Western tourists sitting on the floor scoffing crushed ham sandwiches. They seemed oblivious to the tower's significance, or else saw it as a relic of a lost world that could be admired only because it had been defeated. Asghar, though, looked at the Alhambra as a warning from history. He wanted to explain all this to Zahra, but she was too busy retying her hair into a bun. She pushed her large sunglasses over her head. "Time for a selfie?" she asked. And so I'm fascinated by these paces and by the sort of the romance, and in a way the sort of dangerous romance and appeal of faded glory in that way. Because as, in a way, Zahra's attitude is that it's just another sort of historical site, quite interesting, a place to, put on Instagram. But for Asghar, he really feels it. He really feels this tug, this pull. And it's because he can map 15th century Spain, of course a completely different and very complex situation, onto what he feels like is his own experience. The idea, the threat that, somebody might want to convert you. You get expulsion or conversion, And conversion, of course, works in very subtle ways. In the 15th century, there was a choice for Muslims and Jews: you convert or you leave. Of course, then even those who converted were eventually kicked out anyway. But here it's a more sort of subtle process of conversion. It's not like you have to become a Christian, but you sort of have to, if you're to get on and to sort of integrate, whatever that means, you do have to compromise, you do have to change, and ultimately your beliefs do become something else. And to what extent do you put a stop to that process and you say, no, I'm going to retain the integrity of my beliefs? To what extent you say, well, actually, maybe some of those beliefs, I don't really want to have them anymore, and it's quite liberating to say that you don't have them. Again, this process was in reverse, of course. I mean, if you just go to Istanbul, you can see the Hagia Sophia, which was a great cathedral, became a mosque for many years and is now a museum. But even more interestingly, we recently were in Cyprus, in Famagusta, which is in northern Cyprus, and we saw the Lala Mustafa Pasha Mosque there. And whenever I see a mosque, I always like to go in there. I always like to pray. I always like to sort of recognise that this is an important, to see the architecture and all the rest of it. But it was a deeply uncomfortable place to be in because it's a mosque, but it's a cathedral. It's a church. Really, it looks like a church. It's got a Gothic facade. The Turks put these rather sort of ugly minarets, the 15th and 16th century, just to sort of Islamify it. And when you walk in, it looks like you are in a church, but they've just sort of crossed it over. So in a way, it felt very uncomfortable being in that space as a Muslim, because it felt like it was a sort of an imposition in some ways. Basically, the same feeling that Asghar would be feeling, but in reverse. And what's so interesting about the Cordoba Cathedral, there's a later scene, the Cordoba Mosque Cathedral, later scene which they move on to later, is that some of the most beautiful aspects of the mosque have been preserved only because it was turned into a cathedral. So there's a wonderful mihrab, a prayer niche, which is incredibly beautifully decorated, and I think I'm right in saying it's the only mihrab left in Spain, and that's because someone else reconsecrated it. So, and it was preserved in some way. So maybe there was some recognition that that aspect of it was part of its power.
Mm. Yeah, I think this scene is such a kind of important one in the book because it comes quite early on and reverberates throughout the whole book, because it's interesting sort of technically for what it does, which is take the characters out of their community and places them together against the backdrop of kind of centuries of history of antagonism between Islam and Christianity, which they're very much forced to confront and work out how they situate themselves against that context. And I think there's a moment when Zahra looks around and thinks to herself that taking a pew would mean taking sides in an ancient battle, which seems to sort of sum up how hard it is for them, either of them, to avoid that sort of conflict. And she would perhaps rather just avoid it and actually would think the history is quite interesting but doesn't feel that it has to be relevant to her life, whereas Asghar feels very much that he has a sort of a duty, that history is alive, and that gives him a sense of belonging, maybe, if he can take a role in it.
Yeah, so that in a way is talking also about this thing, this globalized Muslim identity, which has come up in the last however many years, 30, 40 years. So, their communities are in a way very, very small, quite constricted, quite sort of culturally as much as religiously based. But when you move out into the world, you see that, of course, there's a sort of Western lifestyle that has its own attractions. But there's this other thing called like global Muslim solidarity, pro-Palestine marches, as it said, the legacy of Muslim Spain. And that's another kind of identity to attract and connect to. Because then that means that you don't have to worry about like your community. You can just connect with other Muslims. And there's converts in there as well. And I like the idea of converts. I'm interested in them. There's a Spanish convert to Islam in the book.
He doesn't like anyone to know that he's called Alonso.
Yeah, exactly. So again, of course, there's an actual identity thing where he calls himself Tariq. A little joke there because, the Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar, it's Tariq was the first sort of person who conquered Spain, and he's not a very sympathetic character. But I did actually once have a conversation with a Muslim convert in Islam, a Spanish convert to Islam, and he did say this quite amazing thing to me. He said that and this goes in the book, I stole it and put it in the book, his grandparents lived in the countryside. And he, growing up as a sort of good Catholic, would go and visit them. And he would see that the way that they did their ablutions, the way they washed themselves in a particular way, he always remembered that, and it was sort of familiar to him. And he said later, when he saw Muslims doing wudu, which is the ablutions you do before you pray, he said there were strong affinities between the way they used to wash their faces and wash their hands and wash their feet. And it seems fantastical, how 500 years on could this memory somehow be preserved? But maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it's a story that he told himself to connect himself to the past. Of course, he didn't call himself a convert, he called himself a revert. And this is a very common thing. Often converts will call themselves reverts. It's as if I'm not actually changing to something else, I'm going back to my authentic identity, which has gone back since generations.
Is that a sort of desire to fit into a narrative or a kind of a pre-existing narrative? Because both of these characters, I think, are also telling stories about, and religion. Zahra refers to religion at one point as a genre that she thinks she's outgrown, and it feels like an interesting sort of literary play, but also about the way that we order or make sense of ourselves or our lives.
Yeah, so when she's young, Zahra, when she's 12 or 13, her critical mind is still alert. When she hears all the lectures at the mosque, her parents are very proud of her because on the way home in the car, she sort of deconstructs them all and sort of analyses them and says what was right about them, what was wrong about them, generally what was right about them and how they worked and all the rest of it. But as she gets older and she's exposed to other things, she just sort of feels like, well, it's a bit like, reading children's books or something. That's what I read when I was a child, and now I'm an adult, I can read other stuff, and it's just boring to me. It's not even she even rejects it; she just finds it irrelevant. There's another little sort of parallel bit where Asghar, when he goes through, something very unhappy happens to him, and he takes comfort in his childhood storybooks about the prophet's life and all the different prophets and the rest of it. So for that, him becomes a sort of comfort, but for her, it's not something that is really.
And he wants to watch a rom-com at one point, and she turns it off.
Yeah. There's particular reasons for that, but Yeah, she's just 3 steps ahead of him. She's gone through that stage and is too, she thinks of herself as too sophisticated for one, which is maybe why they probably weren't very well suited to begin with. Or are they?
You'll have to buy the book. Are there any other sort of literary kind of models for the book that you had in mind? Because I guess the idea of writing about marriage or relationships, but as a way of also talking about society, has a long kind of tradition and history.
Yeah, I mean, there's too many in some ways. I mean, this is the point where I name all really brilliant writers, and then what you have to do is then think, oh wow, that means like he's as good as those writers, and then we create our own sort of misleading narratives of things. But having said that, Daisy Miller is I just love that book so much, and that the spirit of early James and those sort of witty encounters between characters who don't really know what they're doing, I find really fascinating. One of Muriel Spark's lesser-known novels, The Bachelors, I reread recently, and I actually thought I'd read it before, and I see unconsciously I've like absorbed some of that book in there as well, because it's all to do with sort of basically like Catholic love triangles, and certain characters. There's a brilliant bit where I think it's I can't remember which character it was. One of the characters wants to preserve their chastity, so what they do is they eat onions all the time, so they'll be incredibly unattractive to the opposite sex. Unfortunately, the person who is even more attracted to her because of it, because that's exactly what his old girlfriend used to do. Yeah. So it becomes a sort of weird Bible. So I think in her, there's a sort of religion aspect, but there's also the sort of dialogue aspect, because she's so brilliant at that, and also she just is so brilliant at seeing through people, in some ways too brilliant. And I'm a bit more cowardly than that. I'm a bit sort of nicer to my characters than she is.
But that's one of the things that I think that makes this book so brilliant, is that neither perspective is particularly privileged over the other. You really steer a course between them, and it feels like you're presenting them both without any sort of judgment, or you're letting them be, and you're not cruel to them, although... Yeah,
I wanted the book to be balanced, so it is pretty much divided in perspective between the two of them. In a way, it would have been easier just to do the Asghar character, because, he's male, I'm male, it kind of fits, and Zahra could have been the sort of distant ideal figure. But in a way, I wanted to try and set myself the challenge, and I don't know whether I've succeeded, I hope I have in some regard, to get under the skin of this character. As far as writing a female character is concerned, I just decided to write them basically like I would write any other character, and hope no one noticed. Or maybe But
women are completely different.
Maybe women aren't so different from whatever. But others will have to judge.
It might be time to see if anyone else has any questions.
Yeah, we'll release you very, very shortly. But yeah, anyone has any questions? Okay, Iqbal.
How difficult it is to be a critic and an author at the same time?
Yeah, I was telling Francesca earlier, I feel like I'm an aspiring gamekeeper turned poacher turned gamekeeper. So I suppose it is difficult in some ways, but I was a first novel reviewer for quite a while, The Telegraph, and now I feel a little bit bashful about some of the reviews. I dished out to those unsuspecting people. Dream crusher Rahim, they called me. But I suppose you turn on a different, as you're a writer as well, you turn on a different side of your brain. I just think I allowed myself the freedom to write whatever I want, and then I suppose I feel like I turn the critical faculty on later when I come to edit. But yeah, now I'm very wary of reviewing any fiction at all. In fact, I just avoid it completely. Anyone else? Yeah, you can call.
I really like the book. I like the characters. The only point at which that fell through was when Asghar was being really horrible to Zahra after he hacked her Facebook account. But apart from that, I had a lot of sympathy with both. I thought that was quite ugly. But one of the things I'm wondering about, to what extent is it incidental that both the main characters seem to a large extent to have been defined by their fathers in one way or another? She was given a lot of autonomy, more than her contemporaries, and he seems to have been given almost no autonomy. And I don't want to plot spoil, but it's only when the event happens that crushes his father that he seems to become an adult. So why does his father have to be crushed for him to become an adult? And she also says something about her parents. Perhaps her parents would have to die.
I think, in a way, for the characters, so the characters get dominated in a way by their parents. You're right in both those senses. But like dramatically, you need to like somehow clear them out of the way in some ways to allow the characters to move on and do what they need to do. And it's just a process of how we outgrow our parents, or that relationship between our parents changes. We learn to sort of debate with them, discuss with them, think things through, I suppose. Her father does give. I think in a way though, with Asghar, his mother is a sort of bigger character for him. His father is a sort of like quite comedic character, but his mother is someone who really gives him this amazing unconditional love, and it's both kind of incredibly comforting but also stifling for him. For Zahra, she. Zahra's father, who's a doctor and he's educated, he sees through her someone who can live a kind of life, and is impressed by her ticking off all the boxes that maybe he couldn't quite achieve in his own life. So in a way, they're sort of living their lives through each other. But I suppose, the book is dedicated to my father, who died when I was 18 years old, and one of the things that I obviously deeply regret about that is that we never didn't really have the time to develop an adult relationship. It was always a sort of child-adult thing. So maybe there's an element of that plays into it as well. Who knows? Chris, go on.
I wanted to ask you about this process of creating a character who shares certain similarities of background to you. What that process for you was like of him taking on independent life, and how difficult was it for you to have a sense of him having his own thoughts and not your thoughts?
Yeah, well, there's lots of things I disagree with him about, but there's like parts of him that are always in me. I mean, David Chase, the genius who made The Sopranos, he had in writing sessions, he used to say to his writers, okay, let's just sit in a room, and what we want to do is want to write all like the worst things that have ever happened to us. What are the weirdest, the strangest, the most perverse, the most sort of, oh my God, that actually, because real life is obviously throws up all these things all the time. And I suppose that gives you an aspect of its, weird realism. Like all the odd and outlandish things in this book are real, and all the sort of prosaic things are made up. I suppose I don't know if that really helps. But yeah, and I suppose he is quite close. But then Zahra is probably quite closer to me than in many ways than him. I had sort of visual models in some ways of these people in my mind based on two people I knew. So they're always that. So obviously it feels they are very close to me in many ways. They are part of me. I give them my thoughts sometimes, or sometimes I give them my like instantaneous least good thoughts, or the ones that like the thing in Spain really, because I sort of felt a bit like Asghar did. But at the same time, I also knew that Muslim identity is also an imperialized entity. The phrase British Muslim, that we haven't got to talk about it, but it's such an interesting thing because it's both defined by British colonialism because the Britishness aspect of it, but also Islam spread by a kind of empire. So what does that mean? And my ancestors weren't Muslim; they converted at some point. So how that relates to. So you always have this sort of step back, as it were. But there's quite fun because you can actually just let them go crazy with things and let them bash up against other people's views, and I suppose that's it really. Anyone else? Oh yeah.
Hi. It's not a nice question, but you're writing something new.
I'm trying to. Yeah, I'm trying to write a short story at the moment, but that's just so that it takes the pressure off this. So you just feel like, oh, I've got something else on the run. But yeah, you know, I have a full-time job here. I'm very dedicated. It's my full priority, Tom. I'm not slacking off. Don't worry. But yeah, I was very slow with this. But I think I had the first idea of it. I think 2009, something like that. Which is why in the book the characters managed to quite easily like buy a flat, buy a house in Kilburn. And I didn't want to change it, but I think it was pointed out in the editorial process that they probably couldn't afford that at this point. But I suppose it's a continuity error. But you know, there you go. Yeah. Tanjil, go on then.
Hi. Like Francesca, I'm struck by how good and how funny and subtle the dialogue is. And I was wondering. I mean, I hope I'm not letting any cats out of the bag when I recall that you're a one-time playwright, director, actor, even. And to what extent did you see the writing process as a sort of dramatic craft when you were writing this novel?
Yeah, but I think it's I suppose it's a lot of the writers I like are the ones who deal with dialogue. I wrote one play a long time ago. Funnily enough, I was on a stag do last weekend in Amsterdam, and I met somebody there who I hadn't met for a very long time. But they was like, I came to see your play, you know. So I've been reminded of it twice. Now I don't think any extant copies exist. It's like on an old computer that's like impossible to like load now. But yeah, I suppose I've just always liked dialogue. I've always liked plot and I've always liked dialogue because I think they're really interesting ways that you can tell stories. I suppose I'm less interested in writing in inverted commas that you know, maybe because I can't really do fine writing. Maybe it's just this is what I'm interested in because I can do it, or I think I can do it anyway.
And a sort of related question, if I may. Listening to you talk about the novel, you know, you're talking about all sorts of history, theology, philosophy, all these sort of, you know, ideas. And when I read your non-fiction, your criticism, it's also very rich, very erudite. And it's really striking how your fictional prose seems really subtle and sort of everything that's going on seems much more subterranean and not explicit. And I think that's quite impressive how you can have these two different styles. And I wonder, was that difficult, or didn't you even notice?
Like all the ideas that you have, I think this is true for a lot of writing, they're just churning around in your head all the time anyway. You have this internal monologue or duologue where you're going back and forth with ideas. And in fact, the most interesting thing, the secret is the ideas aren't that important, or they're not that, you know, or the issues or the themes, the things that we talk about in these conversations isn't actually what the book is made up of. It's made up of sentences and drama, and it's made up of the sort of, you know, the problems that I set myself in writing a piece of fiction is, does this work technically? Those are the only questions, and I think that's what all writers really think about. The rest is all there, and it sort of flows. Because of course, a lot of this conversation that we've been having, I didn't really think about any of this stuff consciously when I was doing it. I'm now sort of doing a critical appraisal of my own book, as it were, to try and like explain it to people in some ways. But hopefully, the writing that I respond to is not because at the end of it, I now believe that X people are fully human and we shouldn't discriminate against them, or something like that. Or now I believe that someone's silent story needs to be told. I don't know. I don't really. It's fine for some people. That doesn't really appeal to me. What's interesting to me is the texture of the words and the drama, really. And the rest is fine. People can read whatever they want into it. But that's the kind of writers I respond to.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It was really, really good to talk to you, and everyone needs to buy this book. It has texture, plots, clubbing scenes, everything you could want. And I think Samir's going to be doing lots of signing
signing upstairs. The garden is going to be open so we can go out and have a drink. Soft or non-soft?
Or honey.
Or
Like-
honey, yeah. Maybe I haven't got any honey. Thanks so much, Francesca. Thanks so
Thank
much.
you. Great. We get rid of these.
Yeah,